Star Walker Studios presents Game Master's Journey, your multi-dimensional RPG podcast. Hello, gamer! Welcome to episode 130 of Game Master's Journey, your multi-dimensional RPG podcast. I'm Lex Starwalker, and on this show, we discuss the craft and the art of game mastering. Not only do I pass along any wisdom that I've gained over 25 plus years of running RPGs, I also share wisdom from guest GMs and listener GMs like you. Today, I'll discuss some revisions I'm considering for Primordia as I begin preparations for my first campaign in the setting. I'll also answer a few remaining listener questions about Primordia. So I am really excited to talk about Primordia today. I always enjoy doing world building episodes. They're, I think, my favorite episodes to do. I just really love our world building discussions. And it's funny because, you know, I write the episodes ahead of time and then I produce the episode. And usually while I'm writing the episode, I get all kinds of new ideas for the setting. And then when I'm recording the episode, a lot of times I'll come up with even more ideas that I share with you kind of on the fly while I'm recording. And then even better, once the episode is out, I get comments and feedback from you, which lead to even more ideas. And it's a lot of fun for me. I love the creative process. I love coming up with things and fitting different ideas together. And I'm really enjoying it. And I am running Storm King's Thunder now on YouTube Gaming. So every Thursday from 3:30 to 7:30 p.m. Pacific time, I live stream the game. And then later I edit the videos and put the videos up. So if you can't watch it during the live stream, you can watch the sessions later in an edited format. So we're having a lot of fun with that. We've had 2 sessions now and have a great group of players. We're having a lot of fun. So definitely check that out. I'll have it linked in the show notes at starwalkerstudios.com. But this last week when we were playing, one of the players, I think it was Dwayne, asked me if I'm sick of the Forgotten Realms yet, because Storm King's Thunder is in the Forgotten Realms and I'm just running it in the realms. I considered converting it to Primordia, which I think would be doable as long as I played in the kind of post or pre-retreat time period. But the main reason I decided to run Storm King's Thunder is I didn't feel like I had enough time right now to devote to completely creating a campaign from scratch. So I thought, you know, I could kind of phone it in a little bit by running a pre-published campaign and hopefully saving me a little bit of time. And I apologize, this is kind of rambly and stream of consciousness, but you know, something I'm trying with this campaign is I'm trying to be a little bit more improvisational with it. And Storm King's Thunder lends itself well, I think, to a more kind of sandbox approach. And in fact, a good chunk of the campaign is kind of letting the player characters kind of do what they want, go where they want. And really kind of the whole campaign is that way. And so I think it's very possible that my campaign may end up in a very different place than the published campaign does. We'll see. So between using a pre-published campaign and trying to do more on the fly and be more sandboxy with it, I was thinking, well, you know, that'll save me some prep time. So I'm trying to stretch myself as a GM. I'm the kind of GM that does a lot of prep, and I don't like to run a game unless I feel like I'm well prepared for it. And so I'm experimenting with doing less prep, or at the very least, prepping more to improv as opposed to more the kind of traditional prep that I usually do, if that's even a thing. So we'll see how it goes. So anyway, Dwayne asked me if I was sick of the Forgotten Realms yet. And, you know, it's kind of funny. And you probably have seen this through the episodes of this show, if you've been with the show for a while. I kind of have this love-hate relationship with the Forgotten Realms. There are some things about the Forgotten Realms that I really like and I think are really cool. And there are other things about the Forgotten Realms that I really don't like and I think are kind of dumb or ill-conceived. And I think that the realms as a whole, if you take the entirety of the realms geographically and historically, is a mess. And I think that the majority of the mess that is the realms can be laid at the feet of Wizards of the Coast in their changes that they've made to the setting through the editions. You know, it's like every new edition, they feel like they need to make these sweeping changes to the realms to make it fit the new edition. And, you know, we saw some of this in 3rd edition, and I think that the changes for 4th edition were even more extreme. And then now we have 5th edition with still more changes. And unfortunately, these changes, the in-world explanations that they come up with to make this all try to make sense to you, it's very contrived. It's very just poorly done, I think. You know, it's this thing where we come up with these changes we need for the world because the mechanics of the game have changed and we want the setting to reflect that. And then later we try to figure out some way to make sense of that. And unfortunately, that just doesn't work super well. And you end up with these really contrived things that, at least to me, greatly undermine the setting and make it a much less cool setting and much harder to take seriously. But all that said, there are things about the realms that I like, and you just can't ignore the amount of development that's been done with the realms. You know, just looking at 5th edition sources between the Sword Coast Adventurer's Guide, which has quite a bit of material about the Sword Coast North area, and you've got quite a bit more material on that area in Storm King's Thunder, as well as bits and pieces in all of the other published adventures like Lost Mines of Phandelver, Out of the Abyss, the Tyranny of Dragons adventures, Princes of the Apocalypse. You know, all these adventures have various locations and NPCs in the realms that they detail. So if you take all of that 5th edition stuff and you put it together and you consider just the Sword Coast North as a campaign setting, it's pretty well developed and there's a lot there for you. And then if you go beyond to, you know, the Forgotten Realms wiki and material from previous editions, which would allow you to expand greatly beyond just the Sword Coast North, there's almost a limitless supply of locations, NPCs, story ideas, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So, you know, that I like. And I've always kind of felt this way about the realms. I think, at least for me, if I just focus on a particular region of the realms that I like, for instance, the Sword Coast North, which in the 2nd and 3rd edition days when I used to run in the realms, I tended to focus on the area called the Silver Marches, and also somewhat the Sword Coast. So my campaigns in the realms usually took place in and around Waterdeep, Silvery Moon, and those areas. And I didn't really do much with the rest of the realms. And I think when you do that, when you just take a specific area of the realms that you particularly like, and you just focus on that and you kind of ignore the rest of it, it's a pretty nice setting. And, you know, if you're talking for 5th edition and you want to focus on the Sword Coast and use 5th edition sources for that, I think it's a pretty well-developed setting. And the way they developed it in 5th edition, I like, because they give you quite a bit to kind of work with, but at the same time, they leave a lot of blanks for you to fill in yourself to make the Forgotten Realms your own. So I think that can work really well. You know, the problem with the realms is when you try to consider it in totality, because when you consider the entire geography of the realms, it's kind of a hot mess because you've got all these disparate kind of genres butting heads within the realms. And then if you consider the entirety of the realms through the history of the realms, it's a hot mess because of all these wide sweeping changes that have been made and the various writers resorting to Deus Ex Machina, literally the gods doing things in the world to explain all this stuff and try to make it fit together. And that's a big hot mess. But if you ignore all that and you just say focus on the Sword Coast and the present day of the game, it's not too bad. So I have very mixed opinions on the realms. And, I've been doing a lot of world building over the last couple years. So for me to run something like Storm King's Thunder in the Forgotten Realms, where I don't have to do all that world building, or at least I can use my world building muscles to fill in the blanks or come up with things on the fly that aren't covered in the published material, it's kind of nice. It's kind of like running D&D with the training wheels on, because there's so much there already that I can just kind of lean on what's provided in Storm King's Thunder and what's provided in the Sword Coast Adventurers Guide to provide a lot of the details that the players are going to want. And I don't have to come up with that stuff. And instead, I can come up with the things that aren't covered. So for instance, in our last gaming session, we were doing a travel montage, and one of my players, Steve, who is Steve Strickland, our tier 4 patron that you hear about every episode. Steve is awesome. And he jumped in, and for his part of the montage, he came up with this halfling village, which the players named Foggy Bottom, that is on the road between Tribor and Longsaddle. And we just started coming up with this village, and it was pretty cool because the realms is big enough that you can kind of put a village like that anywhere you want. Like there's room for it. Even with all the villages and towns and cities that we know about in the realms, there's still tons of room for things that aren't in the canon or whatever, that are specific to your particular version of the realms. So that's kind of cool, And, so you might be wondering, why is any of this relevant to today's topics? Well, to bring this all back, I want to thank you, the listener of the show, and specifically you, the listener of the world building episodes and segments of the show, because I kind of wonder if it weren't for the fact that I was talking about Primordia on this show, and if it weren't for the fact that I get so much feedback about it from you, I have to wonder if I would have gotten as far as I did, because I would always have this temptation of, well, I could just run my campaign in the realms and it'd be so much more easy. And I wouldn't have to come up with this stuff, or at least I wouldn't have to come up with everything, right? I would have this firm foundation and I could build on that, and I could throw out things I don't like in the canon and add my own things, all that I wanted, which is what I used to do in the 2nd and 3rd edition days. So that would be a constant temptation. And I think just due to my tendency to be lazy, that I might have fallen prey to that, and Primordia would not be nearly as well developed as it is. Even now it's a temptation when I think about starting a new campaign. It's like, oh, well, I could do it in Primordia, which is what I'm going to be talking about today, starting to think about my first campaign. But then it's like, I realize like all this work that has to be done before I'm really ready, even for the first session. For instance, my city of Elandria really needs to be fleshed out quite a bit before I'm going to be comfortable actually running sessions in it, because the players are going to have a lot of questions, and I want to have answers for at least some of those questions ahead of time. I mean, probably can't have them all, but at least have something, right? More than I have now, at least. So yeah, it's kind of interesting. And, that's something that all of us have to kind of weigh and decide what we're going to do as game masters and world builders. How much are we going to use published stuff, and how much are we going to use original stuff? And you can always walk a middle ground where, you could have your own campaign world like Primordia and just steal liberally from the Forgotten Realms or Eberron or any other setting that you want to use, and say, oh, Waterdeep is a city in Primordia, because I like Waterdeep, and why reinvent the wheel? I'll just stick it in Primordia. So that's something you can do. You can kind of walk the middle road, or you could do like I used to do and say, well, I'm running in Forgotten Realms, but I'm making a lot of changes, so it's not canon Forgotten Realms at all. So you could go either way. You could have your own world and steal and just take things whole cloth from other worlds and put them in your world. Or you could start out with a published setting, but liberally make your own changes so that eventually, after years of running campaigns, it kind of becomes your own setting. So me, I'm trying to come up with something unique and original that doesn't have parts of the realms or Dragonlance in it. But part of the idea of Primordia is it's really big. It's on a super Earth. So there's so much room that I kind of leave it open that in the future I can kind of do what I want. So I could someday in the future say that Waterdeep is a city in Primordia, and I could easily come up with reasons why we've never heard of it before because it's really far away or whatever, if I wanted to. So it's always good to have options. Always leave as many options open as you can. At least that's my philosophy. All right. So before we get more into this, I do want to remind you of some topics I'm going to cover in future episodes that I'd love to get your thoughts on. So one of those is a revisit of last week's topic, which is gaming between sessions. How do you keep player interest high between sessions? How do you keep the game going between sessions? So Shane joined me last week on episode 129, and we had a great discussion on it. But I have gotten a lot of feedback from listeners with even more ideas of strategies that you can use to keep the game going even when you're not all together playing. So I'm going to do another episode on the topic, and I'm going to cover ideas from listeners that Shane and I haven't already covered. So if you have any thoughts or ideas on that topic that Shane and I didn't get, then definitely feel free to let me know. I will have a link in the show notes for episode 130 at starwalkerstudios.com to our discussion in the Game Master's Journey community, where you can add your ideas, and I'll discuss that in a future episode. Also, another topic I'm going to discuss in a future episode is what to do when you've been too generous as a GM and you've given the player characters too much money, too much loot, too many magic items, too many bits of technology, too much whatever, too many rewards. You've been too generous, and now maybe the player characters are so powerful you don't know what to do with them anymore, or maybe you feel like there's not a strong incentive to adventure anymore because they have everything they need, or for whatever reason you're just not comfortable or happy with where things are at, and you feel like, I've overdone it. I've given the player characters too much. What do I do now? How do we solve this problem? And this idea came from a listener who posted a question on the Game Master's Journey community. And I had some ideas, and some other listeners had some ideas. And I will have a link to that topic as well at starwalkerstudios.com. So if you have any thoughts on ways to handle that situation, you can let us know. And I will bring in all the best ideas from listeners when we discuss that topic in a future episode.
This is Shane from the Total Party Thrill podcast, and you're listening to Lex Starwalker on Game Master's Journey.
I want to give a quick shout out to the patrons of Starwalker Studios. The support of the patrons makes this show possible. If you enjoy Game Master's Journey and you'd like to give a little back, becoming a patron is a great way to do so. Patrons get some cool perks like game material I make for Primordia and access to a special monthly podcast I produce just for the patrons. I'd also like to give a huge shout out and thank you to my Tier 4 patron, Mr. Steve Strickland. Let's hear it for Steve.
Yeah.
Yes.
You the man.
Thank you so much, Steve, and thank you to all the patrons. You can find out more about becoming a patron by clicking on the Patreon button at the top of the show notes at starwalkerstudios.com. All right, so I have been working on my world of Primordia for, I think I'm going on 2 years now. And you can go all the way back in the archives of the show and go back to the very first world building episode I did. And if you listen to that, you'll see a lot of differences between what I was saying back then and what I'm saying now. So already my world has had some major revisions or some major course changes since I first started thinking about building my own world for 5th edition D&D. But this is the first big change since the reboot when I christened the world Primordia, and I kind of came up with a lot of the foundational ideas of what Primordia is now. So I kind of had my my version, I don't know, 0.5 D&D world, which was some very general ideas, but I hadn't really focused in on exactly what I wanted yet. And then I had kind of the 1.0 version, which I think if you look at the show notes for this episode or any of the world building episodes, that goes back to world building number 5, which was episode 57. So that was kind of the beginning of Primordia, kind of version 1.0 of my world. And so now today, facing yet another pretty major revision, I think, at least about some things. And, enough that I'm kind of considering this like Primordia 2.0. And I think that this is an important thing to share with you on the show, because I really want you to understand that world building is a process, and it's an ongoing process. It's a never-ending process. You're never really done. And even once you're to the point where you're running adventures in your world, you're still not done. And you still have the ability and the possibility of making major revisions if you want to or you need to, just because you're running adventures in your world and you've already kind of established certain things about your world at the table in play, doesn't mean that you can't change things if something's not working or if you have a better idea. Maybe you can be super creative and you can figure out ways to explain those changes in world. So these changes actually happened in the setting, which would be super cool and probably would be the ideal way to do that if you're already running campaigns in the setting. Or you can just retcon if you have to. If it's going to take a lot of time and effort to figure out how to make sense of these changes, and you're not really interested in that, you just want to get on with things, then just retcon it if you have to. Your players will understand. This is a work in progress, right? Now, as you spend more time in your world and it gets more developed and more fleshed out, chances are probably less and less as time goes on that you're going to make some kind of major revision that's going to require retconning previous adventures and campaigns and things like that. As your world matures, it kind of becomes more secure in itself. And any revisions or changes that you make will tend to be more small in scope or, only affect a certain area or something like that. But if you need to make a major change, don't be afraid to do that, even if you're already running adventures. I think that's important. I think that's important for us all to remember, because you can get to this feeling where you feel like you're committed to your ideas that you've had before, especially if you're running adventures and you've told the players, like, this is the way it is. Or if you're making a podcast and you've told your listeners, this is the way it is. You can feel like you're married to these ideas and you can't change them. And I just want you to always remember that you can. Don't ever feel trapped. Don't ever feel like you have to throw your world out and start over. You can always fix things. So all that said, due to development of the world on my own ideas and thoughts, as well as ideas and thoughts from listeners, and just ideas and thoughts that have been, spurred by listeners or inspired by listeners, I've made some changes, or I'm considering making some changes to some of the elements of my world. So I thought today we'd talk about that a little bit, and I tell you what I'm thinking. And what I would really like is to hear your opinion and your feedback on these changes I'm considering, whether you think I should make these changes, and if so, how exactly I should do that. So let's get into it. So my first revision has to do with the retreat. Now, I don't want to do a huge recap every time I do a world building episode because we've covered so much ground. I don't want to spend a bunch of time talking about things I've already talked about, but just in case this is your first episode of the show and you don't want to go back and listen to however many world building episodes they've been, just to kind of get you up to speed. One of the basic ideas of my setting is that humanity has been reduced to a handful of cities. And these cities are ancient cities that were built thousands of years ago by the elves and have since been settled and expanded upon by humans. And these cities are protected by these ancient magical force fields, kind of like mythals in Forgotten Realms. And these force fields have various properties, some of which I know and some of which I've yet to figure out. But one of their properties, and the most important one for our discussion today, is that they protect the cities from extra dimensional incursions. So you can't teleport or planar travel across the barriers of these force fields. So, my city of Alondria, you can't just teleport into Alondria from somewhere else. You can't plane travel into Alondria from another plane. So they protect from that. And as part of that, they also protect from any kind of planar rift that might open. And one of my foundational ideas for the settings, one of the first ideas I had for the setting, part of what made Primordia was this idea that there are rifts that open to other planes. So you could have a rift that opens to the abyss, or a rift that opens to the plane of fire, or a rift could open to a different material plane. So a rift could open to the Forgotten Realms or to Eberron, or maybe not Eberron. I don't know if you can plane travel to Eberron. I need to learn more about Eberron. But anyway, the point is these rifts were opening throughout the history of Primordia. And because of that, you'd have all these random things in Primordia that came from other places. And as kind of part of that idea, I also had this idea of Primordia being kind of a planar nexus where people who were planar traveling and had some kind of mishap and ended up in a random place often would end up in Primordia. And so part of, this idea of the setting was that it's had a lot of visitors from other planes and other worlds throughout its history. Then I had this idea of humanity being reduced to these handful of cities that are protected from the rifts opening, and that in recent memory, there was an event where the number of rifts opening greatly increased to the point that there were just monsters and horrors everywhere. And any village or town or city that wasn't protected from rifts opening by one of these magical force fields was destroyed because there was just too much to deal with. And the only places that were at all safe were these ancient cities that were protected. So at least, a rift can't open in the city. It might open a mile away, but it can't open in the city itself. So that was kind of my idea of how the world got to the point that it is now, where we have these handful of cities that are very isolated and protected by these magical force fields. And trade between the cities is done through magical portals. So there are special portals that were built with the same magic that built the force fields that allows travel from one city to the other. So you don't have to travel cross country and deal with all the rifts and all the things that come out of the rifts. So that's basically where we're at with Primordia 1.0 and this event that I called the retreat, which was when humanity retreated to this handful of cities and everything else was lost. All the other human settlements were lost. The retreat was caused by a huge increase in the number of planar rifts that were opening and the number or percentage of those rifts that were stable. So I have this idea that you can have an unstable rift which opens to another plane. Maybe it only stays open for a few seconds. Maybe it stays open for a few minutes or a couple hours or something like that, but it's unstable. It will on its own collapse and close on its own in a relatively short amount of time. But then I have this idea of more stable rifts that either may remain open for maybe days or weeks or months before they collapse, or might even be completely stable and will stay open forever. And the idea is that there are magics that can be used to seal these stable rifts. And that's one of the things that adventurers do in my world is they find these rifts and they use magic to seal them so that things don't keep coming into the world from, say, the abyss, which would be bad, right? You don't want demons pouring in all the time. So that was kind of the 1.0 idea. It's like, well, these rifts have always been happening, but for some reason, during the time of the retreat, there's just a lot more of them. And so I think that did a good job of explaining why the world is in the state that it's in when the campaign starts with these isolated cities connected by portals, why people don't tend to travel in the wilds. And it all made sense. It all works. But, now that I have like this concept built that, has its own internal logic and holds together and makes sense, it's like, I don't know, it's almost like the engineering part of the world building is done, at least for that aspect. And it's like, up to this point, I've been a builder, right? I've been doing construction, building this thing and making it functional, making it so that, the building stands up, it supports its own weight, it keeps the rain out, it's a functional building. But not a lot of thought has gone into the aesthetics and specifically the kind of storytelling aspect of this. So once I had this kind of figured out, I started thinking about how is this going to work as far as telling a story? And is there any way that I can improve it so that it's, for instance, more dramatic? So, we have this idea of, the rifts happening all the time. And I've said before that one of the foundations of Primordia is these rifts have always happened and will always happen. The rifts are part of what makes Primordia Primordia. And I'm wanting to change that now because I think that is too limiting. I'm making this commitment that there will always be rifts and it's not something that can be, quote, fixed. And I don't know if I'm comfortable with making that kind of commitment because it's like, well, maybe I'll get sick of having rifts and maybe I'll get tired of feeling like every adventure or every campaign I've got to feature the rifts enough so that, players are impressed with, hey, this is part of the setting. That might get old after a while. I want to leave myself an out where if the rifts aren't working or we're getting bored with it, I can just kind of not do it anymore. Right? I don't want to make these absolute statements that I have to uphold forever and ever and saying the rifts will always be a part of Primordia. They're part of what makes Primordia Primordia is a very absolute statement. Right? So I started thinking, I'm like, well, what if I change that? Because from a story and a drama perspective, it would be much more dramatic to say that the rifts weren't a thing before and that these are a new occurrence and that the events or the event that led to the retreat was actually these rifts beginning to open. And it wasn't a thing of, oh, the rifts have always been a thing. Now there's just more of them. It's much more dramatic to say, no, the rifts weren't a thing. And in recent memory, all of a sudden these rifts started opening all over the place and we don't know why. And we had to do something about it. And I think that makes it more dramatic, makes it more interesting. And there's more story potential there. Because now if I wanted to run a campaign or an adventure during the time of the retreat, I mean, how much more dramatic would that campaign be if we go from a world that's kind of very similar to the Forgotten Realms or any other D&D world to a world where suddenly there's these planar rifts opening all over the place to all these different planes and all these things are pouring out. Like that's a huge change. That's a lot of drama. And to play characters in that time period where this, this stuff starts happening, I think would be a lot of fun. As opposed to saying, oh, well, there's always been rifts, but now there's just more of them. Like that's a little less interesting. It's a little less dramatic. It's less of an extreme change from the way things were to the way things are now. And part of what makes a good story is change and conflict, and you think about good stories and they usually start with some kind of major change. And it talks about this in the Dungeon Master's Guide when, coming up with your campaign or whatever, having some kind of big event that happens that's kind of in the background or the backdrop of your story, like this big thing happens, right? So that is a lot more dramatic if if we go from 0 to 100 as far as the rifts, instead of going from, 50 to 100. And if I say that the rifts have always been a thing and will always be a thing, they're just not as interesting anymore. Anything that goes on forever becomes status quo pretty soon and just becomes, whatever, right? And I want the rifts to kind of be a big deal. I want them to be interesting. I want that to maybe be a mystery that player characters want to solve. Why are these rifts happening? What's going on? Is there some kind of pattern to them that we can figure out? What's going on? So I think it's much more dramatic and much more interesting to say that these rifts opening is a relatively new phenomenon. And so I can say that something, a specific event, a particular thing happened that opened Primordia up to the rifts, which is more interesting than just saying there have always been rifts and nobody knows why. Rifts began opening all over the world all the time, and they almost tore the fabric of Primordia's reality apart. The gods had to step in and hold the world together. This greatly reduced the frequency with which rifts opened, and they're more prone to be unstable as opposed to stable now that the gods have intervened. But they're still happening. They're still opening. So in the campaign setting, after the retreat, now the rifts are a thing. They weren't before the event, what I'm calling the event, the whatever happened that started the rifts opening and led to the retreat. They're not happening as much as they did during that time. It's been greatly reduced because the gods did something, but they are still happening. So there's this sense that whatever the gods did, it's kind of more of a patch than a fix, if you get what I'm saying. The gods didn't solve the problem. They didn't necessarily address the cause that led to the rifts opening, but they've done something to reduce the severity. But it's kind of like a patch, right? They didn't completely fix the thing. They just patched it. So there's this feeling or this possibility that, well, maybe what the gods did won't last forever. Maybe we need to figure out what's going on and solve the root problem before the patch that the gods made wears out. Because, one would think if the gods could have just fixed it, they would have. And the fact that they didn't, and they just kind of sort of fixed it or made it so it's not so bad, seems to indicate that, well, they did what they could do and maybe the rest is up to us. Which I like. I don't want Primordia to turn into this Deus Ex Machina playground that the Forgotten Realms is, where, my gods are just always going in and changing things, and the player characters are just reacting to what the gods do. And, if you run or play many Forgotten Realms adventures, especially, these campaigns that we're getting for 5th edition, that's very much the feeling that you get. Like, the real characters of the story, the real heroes of the story, the real movers and shakers of the events in the realms are the gods and various uber powerful Mary Sue NPCs like Elminster. They're not the player characters. Your player character is never going to be the main character of the story in the Forgotten Realms. Storm King's Thunder, perfect example, and I don't want to spoil Storm King's Thunder for anybody, but, if you go and you learn about kind of what the synopsis of Storm King's Thunder is, it's very much involving the gods and the giants, and doesn't really have anything to do with the player characters at all. And so you're kind of playing supporting roles in the story where I think most of us could agree in a role-playing game, your characters should be the main characters, not supporting characters. So I always want to keep that in mind in Primordia, and I don't want my gods to be controlling the story. I want the player characters to be controlling the story. So I really like this idea of the gods stepped in, they helped out, they did what they could, and basically bought us time. The gods bought us time to figure out why these rifts are opening and figure out some way to fix whatever's wrong with Primordia that's leading to these rifts. They've bought us time to do that. If the gods wouldn't have stepped in, there would be no Primordia anymore. It would have been ripped into a million pieces. But they patched it, they held it together, but it's temporary. So now the player characters have to fix it. Or, well, the guild does, but the player characters obviously are going to be a big part of that. So discovering what caused the rifts and what the gods did to prevent the destruction of Primordia, and why whatever the gods did didn't stop the rifts completely, these are all questions that player characters will hopefully find the answers to in the first Primordia campaign, which I've started planning. It will ultimately be up to the PCs whether things hold as they are now or get worse, perhaps leading to the end of the world as we know it, or leading to a world where there's a lot more rifts than there are now, and where maybe even some of these remaining human cities like Alandria that are protected by the mythos, for lack of a better term, maybe it starts getting worse again, and maybe some of those cities fall. Maybe, that's not enough to protect them anymore, and rifts start opening in the cities or start opening close enough that it's still a problem. Maybe the PCs can even stop the rifts completely. I think that's a possibility I would allow for. It would not be at all easy, but it would be possible. So, that's kind of what I'm thinking. So I've revised things so that the rifts have not been going on forever. The rifts are something that began recently. And by recently, I mean within the lifetime of currently alive humans. So, right now I'm thinking that the campaign will start maybe a couple years after the retreat. So maybe the event that led to the opening of the rifts, which led to the retreat, that event might have happened maybe a year or two before that. So maybe at most 5 years ago is when the rifts started opening. We don't know why. That's one of the things the guild is scrambling to figure out is what caused this, what happened that led to these rifts opening, and what can we do? And also, it's not known what the gods did to kind of patch things up. And I mean, it's not even known for sure that the gods did something. It's assumed that they did, and people believe that they did. But I don't think it's even known for sure that the gods did do something. But if they did do something, as far as what exactly they did and why, nobody knows. So I like having mysteries for the player characters to solve, right? If they want to. I think that's fun. So what do you think of this revision? Do you agree with me that having the rifts opening be something that started happening recently, and having it be this event where it went from, we don't have planar rifts, or at least no more than any other D&D world, to now all of a sudden overnight they're all over the place? Do you agree that makes it more dramatic and makes it more something that perhaps player characters can address? Right? Because it seems like to me, if the rifts have always been, it doesn't seem like something that player characters could do anything about. Or at least if I was a player in this campaign and the dungeon master told me, oh, there's always been rifts, I wouldn't even consider maybe this is something I could stop, because I'm like, well, it's just part of nature, right? It's like changing which way the earth spins. It doesn't really occur to you that that's something you could do because it's just part of the natural order. But if it's something that just started happening 5 years ago, then, well, maybe that's something that something could be done about. So what do you think about the revision? Do you think it makes things more interesting? Do you think it gives us more dramatic possibilities for campaigns and stories to be told in Primordia? What do you think? My favorite part of the show is when I hear from listener GMs like you. If you have feedback for the show, whether it's a comment on today's topic or an idea for a future topic, I'd love to hear from you. There are a lot of great ways to get a hold of me. You can email me at gamemastersjourney@gmail.com, follow me on Twitter @LexStarWalker, Google plus LexStarWalker, and finally, you can visit the website starwalkerstudios.com to get links to my Patreon page, YouTube channel, and more. So returning to my discussion of Primordia 2.0, another area that I've been thinking about revising some of my ideas is the area of player character races or species. So I've talked before about removing or not having halflings and gnomes in Primordia. And what I was going to do is I was basically going to go back to the early days of D&D in which gnomes were a subtype of dwarf and just say, okay, the gnomes are dwarf subraces. They're just different dwarf subraces. And the tinker gnome, I kind of reskinned it because I didn't want to have like so much the clockwork stuff and the steampunk stuff in Primordia. So I kind of reskinned the tinker gnome as being a dwarf that's a really good artificer and really good at specifically crafting magical arms and armor, but also other kinds of magic items. Because I was also saying that dwarves are descended from the Fae, just like elves are. And so my idea was, well, this is the subtype of dwarf that still has that stronger connection to magic that a lot of the other dwarves have kind of lost as they moved away from their Fae origins. So I said, we'll take the tinker gnome, we'll kind of reskin it as a subtype of dwarf that has really good abilities with enchanting arms and armor and things like that. And then the forest gnome, I was just going to do away with. And then the halflings, I was going to replace with a fey race. I was going to come up with a small, probably flying fey race that had, some of the abilities like the luck abilities of the halflings and stuff like that. So that's what I was thinking. But kind of the problem with that is like I've started running Storm King's Thunder, and 2 of my 5 players are playing halflings. Now, in all my years playing D&D, I can probably count the number of gnome PCs I've had at the table, whether I'm running the game or someone else is, on one hand. And they were all illusionists. So gnomes, taking gnomes out of the game probably wouldn't bother that many people, especially if I had another race that basically got the things that the gnome got, like an intelligence race. I don't think too many people would be too upset about that. But people do seem to like their halflings for whatever reason. So, part of my philosophy going into building this world way back in the 0.5 version, in the very first world building episode, was I didn't want to change things in the player's handbook. I wanted a player who is brand new to Primordia sitting down at my table for the first time. I wanted to be able to tell that player everything that is in the player's handbook you can take to the bank. So you could come to the table with a character based on the player's handbook and you'll be fine. Well, if I take out 2 of the races from the player's handbook, or I change them and say, oh, well, halflings are actually this totally different fey race and gnomes are actually a type of dwarf, like I lose that, right? I can no longer tell that player, oh yeah, build a character from the PHB and you'll be fine. It's like, well, no, I gotta give you some exceptions. So I kind of didn't like that. Also, I firmly believe in not limiting player options without a really good reason. And even if I have a really good reason, I feel like any option that I take away, I should create a new option to replace it, which is why I was like, well, if I take out the halflings, I'm going to create a new race to replace them that will even have some of the same abilities. Like, for instance, the luck ability that only a halfling gets. Like, I would have a race that would have that because I wouldn't want to take that option away from players completely. I would just want to change what that option looks like, if that makes sense. Reskin it, basically. So I believe pretty firmly in that philosophy. And, really my only reason for getting rid of halflings and gnomes was that I personally don't like them. And I don't really want to develop them because I don't like them. And that doesn't seem like a great reason to, remove those options. And it doesn't seem like a great reason to go against my philosophy of keeping everything in the player's handbook in Primordia. So now I'm thinking of ways to include gnomes and halflings while not losing what makes Primordia unique, because I think one of the ways that you can make your setting unique is through the player character options, especially races. So you look at Dark Sun, you have Thri-kreen that you can play. You have the moles or the mules that are half dwarves that you can play. You have the, I forget what they're called, but the half elf, halflings that you can play that aren't options in, say, the Forgotten Realms. In Eberron, you have the Warforged, right? So that's part of what makes those settings unique and different from, say, the Forgotten Realms or Dragonlance. Oh, well, you have these options that you don't have in other settings. In Dragonlance, you have the Urda, right? So I kind of like that. But, again, if I'm going to do that in Primordia, I'd rather do it through adding additional options as opposed to taking away options that are in the player's handbook. So kind of what I'm thinking right now is I'm thinking, I don't know that I'm going to go so far as to say that gnomes are a subrace of dwarf, because again, that would change. It would change their game stats, unless we're going to have a subrace that doesn't follow the rules of subraces in the game and it's completely different. So it would change their mechanics and it would be a pretty substantive change to what's in the player's handbook. So, I'm probably not going to go that route. But what I'm thinking is that maybe gnomes and dwarves could both be offshoots of an ancient fey race. So maybe, they have a common ancestor, basically, to use evolutionary terms. So there was an ancestor to both dwarves and gnomes that was a fey creature. And that creature, just like the elves were originally fey creatures that became natives of the material plane, this fey creature became a native of the material plane. And from this creature are descended dwarves and gnomes. So they're closely related, but they are two separate races. So that's kind of what I'm thinking about doing with dwarves and gnomes. And then I'm thinking that halflings may be descended from a fey race as well, though they would be descended from a different race than the dwarves and gnomes are, and from a different race than the elves are. This kind of depends on how far I go with the fey and fairy or the Feywild being a big deal in Primordia. Right now I'm thinking I want to make it a really big deal. So if I continue that, then, I kind of like the idea of tying as many of the races to the fey as I can. And it kind of creates, I don't want to say factions, but it's like if you think about this, if you say dwarves, gnomes, halflings, and elves are all descended from the fey, right? Half elves are half descended from the fey. You've got humans, so humans would be unique in that they are not descended from the fey. You have dragonborn, which are descended from dragon. You have all your various half races, like you're half fiend and you're half celestial and all that stuff. But then you kind of come down to, you have like your fey descended races, dragon descended races, elemental descended races, fiend and celestial descended races. And then your humans are kind of unique in that they're more native to the world, from the very beginning, as opposed to at some time they were native to the Feywild. So that's one way I could go. I also kind of like the idea of saying that the dwarves aren't descended from the Fey, and they, in that way, they kind of have a stronger tie to Primordia than, say, the elves do, because, they've always been from Primordia, as opposed to the elves that at some point were from the Feywild or fairy. So I kind of like that too. Same thing with halflings. So I don't know. I haven't decided like how exactly I'm going to do that. So what do you think? Do you think it's a good idea to include the gnomes and halflings and figure out a way to find a place for them in the setting? And the other thing is it saves me a lot of work, right? If I'm going to replace halflings with a totally new race, well, then I have to come up with that race and all the sub races and all of that. So that's more time before I can start running adventures, right? So what do you think? Do you think that's a good idea to, have everything in the player's handbook be allowed and differentiate my setting by the additional options that you'll have in addition to that, things like the Genasi and the Goliath and the Minotaur and Asmar and all that good stuff? What do you think? So, one of the things that I'm struggling with this whole topic of player character races is I'm having some conflict between what I would like to allow for player character races from a perspective of what makes sense in the setting that I'm building versus what I think players will enjoy more. So, ultimately I see the possible player character races in Primordia, including all the player's handbook races, as well as Aasimar, which in Primordia are half human, half celestial, the Genasi, which are half human, half elemental, the Goliaths, which are humans with giant blood, the Averial, or as I call them in Primordia, the wind elves, which are winged elves, and the Minotaur, which in Primordia are going to be a seafaring race. And I'm going to kind of get inspiration from the Athaan Mier, or the sea folk of the Wheel of Time. So I'm going to have my Minotaur be like that, where they build the best ships in Primordia. They are the most accomplished naval explorers in the world. And during the time of the campaign, post-retreat, they're pretty much the only ones that still sail. Because, like, for instance, Elandria, they trade through portals now. They don't trade by ships. So they don't sail ships to other cities or other countries anymore. So the idea is only the Minotaur are really still out there sailing beyond just, nearby their settlement. Because, for instance, Elandria has fishing boats because there's part of the harbor around Elandria that's within the Mythal. So they'll send fishing boats out in that area to fish and whatnot. So they have some boats and ships, but they don't go very far from the city. So the idea is that, just like the sea folk in Wheel of Time, the Minotaur, their shipbuilding technology is just beyond that of everyone else. And their culture is all about being on the water. I even like the idea of the sea folk from the Wheel of Time, where when a woman gives birth, she'll give birth on a ship because it's considered bad luck to be born on land. They're buried at sea and stuff like that. And most Minotaur live out their lives on ships. They have very few that live on land, and most of the people, or most of the Minotaur that live on land, only do so periodically. They don't live there all the time. So that's kind of the idea with the Minotaur. So that's kind of what I see as far as these are all the race options that would be available for player characters. However, when I'm thinking about my first campaign, and especially the beginning of the first campaign, it's going to start in Alondria and the surrounding area not long after the retreat, like say a year or two after the retreat happened. So at that particular time and place in the setting, I don't know that it really makes sense to have all of those options available. I really like this idea of players unlocking player character race options as they explore the world and they encounter those races in the campaign. And then those would become options that are available. So, this idea is basically, we start the first Primordia adventure, and maybe I say, for example, dwarves aren't available as a player character option when you make characters for this first adventure, because no one in Alondria has seen a dwarf since the retreat, and nobody knows what happens to the dwarves. We don't know, are the dwarven holds still there? Are the dwarves still around? Were they wiped out? Like, nobody knows. So during that first campaign, if they wanted to, the player characters could travel to a dwarven hold and see, are the dwarves still there? And if they are, they could make contact with, say, hill dwarves that live in this dwarven hold and establish a trading relationship with them, maybe build a portal from Alondria to the hill dwarf hold. And now from that point going forward, the hill dwarf has been unlocked. And now hill dwarf is available as a player character option. And I really like that idea. I think that's a super cool idea because it's a way that in a more kind of sandbox style campaign, you can have a motivation, yet another motivation to explore the world. Because I might tell the players, I have wind elves in my world that are winged elves, which is a flying race. And, if you guys go find a community of wind elves in character and interact with them, then that will basically unlock that option to you. And then if one of your characters dies, or we start a new adventure, or you just want to start a new character, now you can make a wind elf character where before you couldn't. And I think that's really cool because player characters could be like, hey, we could go here and unlock hill dwarves, or we could go there and unlock wood elves, or we could go there and unlock wind elves. It kind of hands it over to the players. Well, what options do you want? And, if you want that option, then you need to go on an adventure and go find those people and interact with them and establish trade relations with them. And now that can be a player character race because now I can explain how there's a hill dwarf in Alondria. Right now, it doesn't make sense. But if you go find a hill dwarf city and you build a portal from there to Alondria and establish trade, well, then from then on, it makes sense to have a hill dwarf PC starting out in Alondria. And I really like that. I like the verisimilitude of it. I like that there's this direct cause and effect, between the reality of the world and the political situation and who Alondria has contact with and who they don't, and what player character options are. And that the players can have some control over that. Because if I have a player that really wants to play a mountain dwarf and that's not available as an option, well, then their characters can go find the mountain dwarves, and now that player can make a mountain dwarf player character. So I think that's really cool. So if I did that, then for the first adventure in Primordia in Alondria, here are the races that would be available. So humans, obviously. Alondria is a human city. I'd be using the human variant or that, it would be a player choice, but you could either use the human variant or not. And at least in the beginning of my Primordia campaigns, I'd like to see the majority of player characters be human because that's what would make sense in this time period. Another possibility might be high elves. There are some high elves that live in Alondria. So this could be a possibility, although I think I would rather not see a high elf PC in the very first adventure. because I kind of have some mysteries surrounding like how many high elves are in the city, why are they in the city, what are they doing in the city, are kind of things that I'd like players to figure out in character. So, it could probably be done, but I feel like it would work better if I didn't have a high elf player character in the group until they figure that out. And then it's like, okay, now you could play a high elf. Half elves would be an obvious possibility in Primordia. There actually are a few half elves in Elandria, as there are a few elves that live in the city. And anywhere you have humans and elves living together peacefully, you're going to have half elves. Other possibilities in this setup would be Aasimar, Tieflings, half-orcs, Genasi, Goliaths. These are all humans mixed with something else. So all of these would be a possibility in Elandria. And I am, as part of the concept of Primordia, I am coming down and saying that Aasimar, Tieflings, half-orcs, Genasi, and Goliaths are always part human. So you don't have a Genasi that is half elemental, half elf, for instance, which by canon you could have. If you read the Genasi in the Elemental Evil Player's Companion, a Genasi could be of elven descent or dwarf descent or whatever. But I'm saying in Primordia, no. And the idea is, and I actually think this is kind of funny, is the idea is that humans will kind of breed with anything. An elf would never breed with an elemental or a polymorphed dragon or a fiend or anything like it's just not going to happen. Like elves just won't do that. About the only thing that elves will breed with other than other elves are humans. And even that is frowned upon by most elves. It's in fact rare for elves to breed with a different subtype of elf. So it's rare for a high elf and a wood elf to get together. It's unheard of for an elf and a dwarf to get together. And they're also not genetically compatible. So even if an elf and a dwarf did get together, they couldn't have kids, right? So part of the magic, I guess, of humans in Primordia is that for some reason, humans are able to interbreed with far more beings than any of the other PC races are. Who knows why? But I think that's kind of fun. And I think that a thing that is said about humans as kind of an insult by other races is that humans will breed with anything, and humans do breed with anything. And then you'll have various monsters that seem to be a combination of like human and some kind of animal. And, these monsters actually usually came about through some kind of magical experimentation, but a lot of times dwarves or elves or whatever will say, oh no, that actually came about because the human had sex with a bear at some point, even though that's not really what happened. So I think that's kind of funny. I think that'll be fun to play with. And I think it'll give humans a little more to make them unique. Because I do feel like even in 5th edition, humans are kind of generic. And that's why we see so many non-human characters, is because humans are just so generic. It's like, I want to be something unique and interesting. So, I'm going to try to make humans more interesting. So let's see. Halflings, if I go with having halflings in Primordia, I could see there being some halflings in Elandria. I see halflings as not so much having their own communities, but living in the communities of other races. So I could see halflings living in Elandria. A lot of times halflings in Elandria or in another human city would often be in like a servant role, or in a city that has slavery. A lot of times halflings would be slaves. Elandria does not have slavery. I could also see halflings being merchants. I really see halflings like fitting well as merchants in Primordia and just making money hand over fist now that they can just use portals. The Minotaur could be a possible player character option in the schema in Elandria, because Elandria is a port. So even though the ships of Elandria don't leave the harbor anymore, the Minotaur can still come calling. And so that could be a possibility for a player character race. So there we are. But obviously a problem with this, if I go this way, is I'm limiting things quite a bit. I'm saying, well, for this first adventure, you can't be a dwarf. You can't be an elf. You can't be a gnome. I guess that's it. Because you could be a half orc. You could maybe be a halfling. So what do you think? Is that limiting too much? Would that be a bad thing if I say you can't play any kind of elf or dwarf or gnome for this first adventure, but you can play a genasi, you can play a minotaur, you can play a Goliath, you can play an Azamar, all these other options that aren't in the player's handbook you can play, but you can't play any of the elf or dwarf or gnome options. How would you feel? Let me know. How would you feel about that as a player? Would you be okay with that? You feel like, okay, well, some things aren't available, but then there's new things that are available, so it evens out and I'm cool with that? Or would you be unhappy with that because maybe you really like playing elves or you really like playing dwarves? What do you think about that? What do you think about this whole unlocking idea of saying dwarves won't be available until player characters actually go and establish a relationship between a dwarven settlement and Elandria, and then they're available? What do you think about that idea? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Now, one way that I could kind of have my cake and eat it too here is that I could make Elandria bigger than I've previously thought that it is. I noticed that some listeners, I think, are assuming that Elandria is as big as like Waterdeep or Greyhawk, the Free City of Greyhawk. And I'm actually not picturing Elandria at this point being that big. I'm actually picturing it more along the lines of maybe Silvery Moon, or maybe a little bigger than Silvery Moon. But it's not like this huge metropolis like Waterdeep. It's more of a normal sized fantasy city. But, I could have my cake and eat it too here by saying that Elandria is as big as something like Waterdeep. I could have dwarves living below the city. Like I could have kind of like Mirabar in the Forgotten Realms, where you have a human city built on top of a subterranean dwarven settlement. So I could do something like that with Elandria and, say that, below the subterranean fields is a dwarven city. And then now we can have dwarves. I could say that there are a lot more elves in the city than I originally thought. I could have a portal to an elven city and say, well, let's do away with the mystery of what happened to the elves. And instead of that being something player characters figure out, we just have a portal to the nearest elven city of Faeliel. And now we can have all kinds of elf player characters. So that's a different way I could do it. So, that would be fine. That would work. In a way, it would be a good thing because with Elandria being so much bigger, there'd be so many more areas I could develop in the city, so many more possibilities for stories to be told within the city itself. Of course, it'd also be a lot more work and a lot more to develop. But the biggest drawback I see of this is it would remove one of the mysteries that I was looking forward to player characters exploring in the world, which is what happened to the other races. After the event during the human retreat, which that's a very human focused term, what happened to the dwarves? What happened to the elves? Because right now we don't know. And so something that player characters could do is go on expeditions to known dwarf and elf settlements and gnome settlements and figure out what did happen to them. And I think that would be cool. So if I make Elandria this huge city and make all of the race options available from the very beginning, we lose that opportunity. So, like I said, I really like this idea of the player characters going on expeditions to unlock different race options. But at the same time, I could possibly see that getting old. If I'm like, oh, you have to unlock all the different kinds of elves and you have to unlock all the different kinds of gnomes and dwarves, I could see a given group of players having fun with that once or twice. But they're not going to want to unlock like that. Your whole campaign would just be that, right? Like it would take a whole campaign to unlock all the races. So I don't know, maybe I could just say that, once you unlock one of the dwarf subraces, you get access to them all. Or I could say, the gray dwarves, are their own thing. You have to unlock separately. But once you make contact with the dwarves, you get hill and mountain dwarves. I could do that. Same thing with the gnomes and the elves. Like the elves, I could say, once you unlock elves, you get wood elves and high elves and wind elves. But maybe the dark elves you have to do separately. But maybe not, because I've also said that dark elves are not solely subterranean in Primordia. So actually, it would probably be the wind elves that would be the thing you'd have to unlock separately. You'd probably get dark elves. So that's a way I could go. So what do you think? I really want to hear your opinions on this. I'd really like listeners to weigh in. Let me know what you think. Should I just say that Elandria is this big city and or just has trade connections with the dwarves and elves and just say everything's open from day one of the campaign? Or should I say that no, only the races that make sense to be in Elandria right now, which are mainly humans and the various half-human races, are available, and you have to unlock the other races by visiting those places? Do you think I should do that? And if I go that route, should I say that each subrace has to be unlocked separately? Or should I say something like, well, if you go to a high elf city, you can now play wood elves, high elves, and dark elves. But if you want to play the wind elves, because they're even more rare, you have to actually go to a wind elf city. And the same thing with the dwarves. If you go to a dwarf city, now you can play hill dwarves and mountain dwarves. But if you want to play the gray dwarves, you're going to have to find a gray dwarf city. So what do you think? What do you think sounds better? Would limiting it in that way kind of make you less happy as a player to play in that campaign? Or do you think that getting the Aasimar and the Genasi and the Goliath and the Minotaur would make up for not having the elves and the dwarves and the gnomes right away? What do you think? Let me know. I think the thing that makes a tabletop RPG the most enjoyable for everyone at the table, whether you're the GM or a player, is immersion. And one great way to increase immersion in your games is to have great audio. If you're looking for great tabletop audio for your RPG, check out battlebards.com. They have everything from monster sounds and languages to spell effects to music. Original, beautiful music that you can have playing in the background while your player character seduces the love of his life or while your party fights giants or goblins. Head on over to starwalkerstudios.com/support and you'll find my coupon codes that you can use on your first order to get some free bonus tracks. So check it out and take your tabletop gaming experience to the next level with battlebards.com. All right, so I've talked about some of the revisions that I'm considering for Primordia, and I'm really looking forward to hearing what you think of those and what you think I should do. So I thought for the third segment of the show today, I would talk a little bit of some of the things I've started working on in preparing the first campaign, which I'm getting super excited to run. So first of all, regarding joining the Guild of Adventurers, I've decided now that, how the guild recruits, which I talked about on a previous episode, which is basically they will send a party of adventurers that wants to join the guild to a site, basically a dungeon, to explore through either a portal or a teleportation circle or something like that. And now that I've got that figured out, I've got a good outline for the beginning of campaigns involving the guild. And, not every campaign has to involve the guild, but the first one at least will. And so I've started coming up with guild perks that player characters will get at various ranks within the guild. And these ranks will have a level prerequisite. So, say to be a journeyman in the guild, maybe you need to be at least 5th level. So they'll have a level prerequisite, and then they will have a notoriety or standing prerequisite. So as described in the Dungeon Master's Guide, I will come up with different ranks within the guild, and you will have a score, which is basically your notoriety or your standing within the guild. And each rank will have a requirement for what that score needs to be. And you'll be able to increase your score by doing things for the guild and completing quests and stuff like that. So to advance to the next rank in the guild, there's going to be a level requirement, and then there's going to be kind of a story requirement as kind of mechanically expressed as, your reputation score within the guild. Each of the ranks within the guild will have various perks or benefits that you'll get at that rank. And some of those benefits will be magic items. So when you first are inducted into the guild, you will get a magical cloak. And then at a certain rank, you'll get a magical weapon. At a certain rank, you'll get magical armor or some kind of magical defensive item. And again, I've talked about this some in the past, but part of the thought behind this is to allow me to give player characters personalized magic items and have it make more sense than you just happen to find the perfect item for your character in a dragon's treasure hoard. Because instead, these items can be items that are rewarded by the guild. And, the guild has a pretty good supply of magic items to draw from because they have adventuring parties going into places all the time and bringing back magic items. So they kind of have this store of magic items. So it makes sense that they could find an item that really fits your character more so than you just happen to find it under a rock somewhere. So I really like that. And it's also a way that I can give a player character an item when I want them to have it or when they need it. And I don't have to juggle the story and stuff to make it happen. It can be just like, oh, you're this level and you're this rank in the guild, so now you get this thing. So I'm working out the details of that and having fun with that. Another key element of the world of Primordia is this idea of this magic radiation that suffuses the world and seeps into you and changes you the more you use or encounter magic. So, one of the inspirations for Primordia is the Witcher video games. And I really liked how the Witchers, which are kind of like adventurers, have these mutations that they've gone through that give them superhuman abilities, but also set them apart from normal people. And, in the video game, the Witchers have cat-like eyes. So it's obvious when you look at someone that they're a Witcher. And normal people, they respect and fear the Witchers and things like that because it's obvious that they're mutated, right? So I like that idea, and I want to have something similar in Primordia. And the idea is that the magic, as you encounter magic, it kind of seeps into you and it changes you. Now, the thing is, and this is kind of the challenge of designing this mechanically, is I want all player characters to have equal access to this. So I don't want it to be tied to class. So if you're playing a monk, or even a better example is maybe like a champion fighter who really doesn't have any straight up magical abilities. They don't cast spells, they don't have any, abilities that scream, I'm using magic. I still would want that character to have as many effects from the magic of Primordia as someone who is playing a wizard. So I don't want it to be tied to class, because right away when I started thinking of how am I going to represent this mechanically, I thought, well, I could tie it to what level spells you can cast. So every time you get access to a new spell level, you'd get access to a higher powered ability representing your tie to the magic of Primordia. But then I thought, well, that would screw over anybody that doesn't have spellcasting ability. And part of this is I want it to be something that all player characters have equal access to. So it would be probably more tied to your level or your tier or something like that, or maybe your hit dice, how many hit dice you have, as opposed to spellcasting ability. It'd have to be something that everybody has access to. So the idea is that as you use magic, you're affected by that more. And using magic could be casting spells. It could be using magical items, drinking potions, and the idea is even if you're playing a player character that doesn't use magic at all, you're still going to have magic items. You're still going to use potions. You're still going to be visiting sites that have powerful magic where this magic is around you. So the idea is just by being an adventurer, you're going to be exposed to this magic, even if you're not a spellcaster. So like I said, I'm still working out the system for this, but ultimately what I want is I want player characters to get special abilities from this, abilities that aren't tied to their class, that are just from the magic of Primordia changing them. So these could be things like maybe special resistances, different kinds of damage, or various spell-like abilities, cosmetic alterations, things like that. So, these aren't going to be tied to your class. It's going to be a separate standalone system. And I also want it to be personalized to individual PCs. So it's not like every player character is going to get the same abilities. They're going to be different for everybody. And the idea is to use these to more customize your character in a way that you can't do with just class, so that, not every champion fighter is the same. And, some of them, I want to have some cosmetic things, because part of the idea here is that just anyone can look at someone and know that you've been touched by magic. So maybe it gives you an exotic eye color or hair color, or maybe you have glowing magical tattoos or something, but there'll be some thing that anybody can see and be like, oh, this person's an adventurer. This person is touched by magic. And so they're not quite normal. So some of it will just be cosmetic like that, but some of it will be actual abilities. Like maybe you can use a certain spell once per day or something like that. So I've started working on that, but it's kind of tricky figuring out exactly how to make that work. But that's definitely something that I want to have in place for the first campaign. And then the other big thing, kind of mechanically, that I want to add to the game in Primordia is I want to bring back strongholds and followers from first edition, second edition. And, I've started working on the mechanics for this. So I need mechanics for your actual followers. How do you attract followers? When do you attract them? How many? And what type of followers do you attract? What do you need to do to keep those followers? Things like that. As well as, the stronghold, as far as, a lot of this is just coming down to costs. What does it cost to maintain your stronghold? What does it cost to improve its defenses? What does it cost to make it bigger? Things like that. So that's all stuff I'm figuring out and want to have in place. Now, the stronghold and followers, I don't need that at the very beginning of the campaign, because right now I'm thinking player characters will probably start attracting followers at, say, 10th or 11th level. So I have a little time, even once I start running in Primordia, to figure that out. But it is something I need to figure out. So those are just, 3 areas that I'm working on to get a campaign up and running. What's involved with joining the guild? How do the different ranks in the guild work? What's required to gain each rank, and what benefits do you get at those ranks? What are what I call the gifts of Primordia, these magical gifts that you get as you grow in power. And, what are those going to look like? I still haven't even decided whether those will be a thing where at a certain point you get one and I might have a list that players can choose from, or if there'll be things that I come up with, or if it'll be kind of a collaboration. Probably, knowing me, it'll end up being kind of a collaboration between the GM and the player, what these will look like for your character. But I'll have to figure out, how much is that spelled out and how much is it kind of, we figure it out as we go. And then finally, strongholds and followers. I got to figure out, how will you get followers? When will you get them? How are the strongholds going to work? And all that good stuff. So it'll be really fun figuring it out. And I think all of these things will help make Primordia unique and help make adventures in Primordia unique. Or at least I hope so. We'll see. Have you checked out the Game Master's Journey community on Google Plus yet? The Game Master's Journey community is a great place to bounce ideas back and forth with other listener GMs. You can comment on the show episodes, share your own homebrew world, and ask questions of the many experienced GMs that are a part of our community. So I hope you'll check out our community, and I hope you'll join us there. You can find a link to the Game Master's Journey community in the show notes for this episode over at starwalkerstudios.com/Game Master's Journey. All right, for our final segment today, I have a few more listener questions about Primordia that I did not get to in the previous episode that I wanted to address today. So first off, we heard from Gferg, who says, is there going to be a set cosmology, or are the rifts going to interfere with that? As in, we know there are the 9 gods who keep Primordia, and somehow keep other gods from having influence in Primordia. But what about demigods or fiends or other entities of great power? Can they come to Primordia? And if so, do they throw the cosmology into chaos with the 9 ticked off about it? Or is there some hierarchy or mythology that they fit into? So, okay, I'll try to answer that. Yes, there will be things like there's definitely going to be fiends, demons, devils, archdevils, demon lords, all those things, and could actually exist in Primordia itself because they could have come through a rift. There will be probably demigods, but basically how I'll handle demigods in Primordia is demigods will be basically immortal beings that are almost but not quite gods. They won't grant spells or anything like that. I mean, basically there are the 9 gods in Primordia and that's it. So if you're talking about, I want to be a cleric and I want to get spells from a deity, the 9 gods are your option. That's it. There aren't going to be any options. You could worship an archdevil or a demon lord or a demigod, but you're not going to get spells from them because only the 9 can grant spells. Only the 9 have portfolios. Only the 9 are truly deities. So yes, there are powerful beings in the land that may rival the gods in power, but they're not truly gods. They don't have portfolios. They don't have domains. They don't grant spells. Just like your warlock patron, right? Warlock patrons are not gods. They don't grant spells to clerics. They grant spells to warlocks in a different way than a deity would grant spells to a cleric. So, I guess, one thing to wonder about is, well, what would happen if a deity from somewhere else tried to come into Primordia? Would they just not be able to enter? What would happen? And I haven't really thought about this before now, but GFERC's questions made me think of it. And I think maybe what I would do is I would say that the deity could enter Primordia, but in Primordia, they'd basically be a demigod. They would have the power of a demigod, but they wouldn't actually be a deity. They wouldn't have any portfolio elements, and they wouldn't be able to grant spells or anything like that. Because again, the 9 deities of Primordia have a firm grasp on all of the portfolios. So a deity from another world could maybe come into Primordia, but they would only be a demigod. They couldn't grant spells. And if they wanted to be an actual deity, they'd have to take on one of the 9 and try to wrest their portfolio from them, which would probably be pretty difficult to do. All right. So GFERC, I hope I answer your questions. As far as mythologies, or religions, there is room for lots of different mythologies and religions in Primordia because of the aspects. So even though there are only 9 gods, 9 deities, each god can have numerous aspects. And basically those different aspects could be seen as different deities. They could have totally different religions. Their followers could have totally different beliefs. Even down to, one aspect of a particular god might be seen as, quote, good, and one might be seen as, quote, evil. Again, I'm not really using alignment in Primordia, so that's not really a thing. But, you could look at it that way. You could have aspects of the same god that are entirely different, very different. The only thing that would be in common is they have the same portfolio and the same domain. But culturally, as far as what their worshipers believe and how they behave could be completely different. All right. We also got some questions from Will Johnson, who says, you've expressed disdain for Elminster, the Chosen, and other superpowered Mary Sue characters in Faerun. How do you not fall into the same trap with Primordia when you are basing so much of the setting on high-powered magic, gates, and mythals that will likely always be out of reach of player characters? Okay, I'm going to try to answer what you're asking, Will, but I'm not sure that I understand exactly what you're asking. So the first part of this, I've expressed disdain for the Mary Sue characters of Forgotten Realms. Absolutely true. How do I not fall into that trap? Mary Sues are characters, right? So I guess if I write short stories or novels set in Primordia, I would not fall into that trap by making sure that my characters in the stories are not Mary Sue characters, which is to say they can't just be, all good, just always do everything right, always, don't have any flaws or weaknesses or anything like that. So that's just part of developing a good character, right? So hopefully if I write a story in Primordia, I will develop good characters that will not be Mary Sue characters. And if I do inadvertently create a Mary Sue character, hopefully my alpha readers or beta readers or writing group would say, hey, Lex, this character is a Mary Sue. You really need to make this character more realistic, give them some weaknesses or some flaws or something, make them more believable. So as far as from a fictional standpoint, that's how I would do that. I don't see a conflict between having powerful magic in a setting and having Mary Sues. I mean, it's apples and oranges. They're not, I don't see them as related at all. The Mary Sue is a flaw in character. You know, it's making a character that has all the answers and can do everything and doesn't have any exploitable weaknesses. That's what a Mary Sue is. So it doesn't really have anything to do with mythals or portals or anything like that. It's all about the characters, you know, and part of the big problem with, say, the Forgotten Realms and their Mary Sues is that those Mary Sues are NPCs. You know, it'd be one thing if they were player characters and players are playing Mary Sue characters. I mean, again, that's not ideal. And I would encourage players to play characters that are not Mary Sue characters, but at least it's a player character. You know, it's not the end of the world if you have a player playing a Mary Sue character, because it's a player character and the player characters are supposed to be at the heart of the story and they're supposed to be the heroes of the story. Now, I would prefer that my PCs not be Mary Sues, and I would work with players to come up with some flaws or some challenges that their characters have to overcome, but it wouldn't be the end of the world. What would be the end of the world is creating NPCs that are Mary Sues, because then they're going to outshine the player characters, unless the player characters are also Mary Sues, in which case you have a world full of Mary Sues like the Forgotten Realms, which is not what I want. So from a more kind of gameplay perspective, how would I avoid the Mary Sues is I just wouldn't make Mary Sue NPCs. I'm not going to have my NPCs be the real hero of the story. The hero of the story is going to be player characters. It's not going to be my NPCs, you know? So I'm not going to have an Elminster that's this perfect character that is all powerful and has all the answers. You know, my NPCs will be flawed. They're not going to have all the answers. They're not going to be all powerful. And it's going to be up to the player characters to find those answers. So I think, you know, if I'm understanding Will's question, which I may not be, I'm not sure that I am, but if I am understanding what Will's asking here, I think where you avoid the problem of Mary Sues, it's not so much in your setting, it's in your adventures that you create and the stories that you run or the game sessions that you run for your player characters, and just making sure that your NPCs aren't stealing all the spotlight or hogging all the spotlight from the player characters. If that's happening, you might have Mary Sue NPCs, or you're just too in love with your NPCs and you need to put the spotlight on the player characters. So I see that more as how you run the game as opposed to how you design the setting. You know, even Forgotten Realms with all these Mary Sue characters like Elminster and the Seven Sisters and Drizzt Do'Urden wouldn't be so bad if they were just NPCs that stayed in the background and weren't involved in what the player characters are doing. I think the real problem and what really irritates people about the Forgotten Realms and the Mary Sues is that they are so often a part of what the player characters are dealing with. They're part of the adventures that are published for Forgotten Realms, that you have to deal with these Mary Sue characters. I think that's where the problem is. If they were just characters in the fiction, but you never saw them at your gaming table, I don't think people would care so much. But I could be wrong. I'm not really that steeped in Forgotten Realms to really know why people are annoyed with the Mary Sues. I just know that they are. So the other part of Will's question here is he mentions you are basing so much of the setting on high-powered magic like the gates and the mythals that will likely always be out of the reach of the player characters. So again, I don't see this as all related to the Mary Sue thing. I think maybe Will's asking two separate questions here. I'm not sure, but I don't see a problem with having high-powered magic that is out of reach of the player characters, which I think maybe what Will's saying here is he sees that as a potential problem of having elements of the setting that are out of reach of the player characters. I don't see a problem with that. nowhere in D&D have I ever, or any RPG really, have I seen it written that the player character should have the capability to become all powerful and become gods or even greater than gods and be able to control everything in the world. I've never seen that written in D&D. I don't think that's an assumption that most of us make about D&D. I definitely don't make that assumption as a player or a DM. You know, at the end of the day, yeah, player characters are heroes. Yes, player characters are powerful and far beyond the power of your average person in the world, but they're not all powerful. There are always going to be things in the world that are more powerful than the player characters, that are wiser, that are smarter, that have better information. That's part of what makes it a game. If the player characters are all powerful and there's nothing bigger than them on the board, it's no longer a game. There's no chance for failure. There's nowhere to grow. There's no arc capability there. It's like, what's the point of playing, right? I mean, even if your player characters are 20th level, even if your player characters are greater than 20th level, there are bigger, badder things out there than the player characters, which is why we sit down at the table every week to play this game, because there's a challenge to be overcome. There's a chance for failure. There's a chance for catastrophic failure. And that's what makes the game fun. If winning is guaranteed, if there's no chance for failure, it's not a game. It's not fun. So I don't see a problem with having magics in the world that are out of reach of the player characters. I think that's totally fine. Again, it's part of the setting. And even if I have NPCs that have access to the old magic and can do things that the player characters will never be able to do, that's okay too, as long as they're not Mary Sue NPCs that are walking all over player agency and stealing spotlight from the players. And as long as I'm not making the story about my NPCs instead of about the player characters. You know, you can have a character like Elminster in your world. You can have a character like Dritz in your world, and it can be okay. Even if they're a Mary Sue, it can not be a big deal. It's all in how you use that player character or that non-player character as a GM. If you're using it to further the story and to show the player characters that, hey, there are things that are greater than you in the world, you're not the end all be all, I think that's fine. You know, as long as you're letting them be in control of their own destinies and tell the story they want to tell, and you're not strong-arming them with your NPCs and having the NPCs make all the decisions and do all the cool things in the story, I don't think it'll be a problem. So, Will, I hope I addressed your question. I'm honestly not sure if I did. I'm not sure I understood your question. So if I'm totally in left field, feel free to let me know, and maybe I can take a stab at it again. Also heard from DM Nell, who says, so far you've discussed big topics such as the portals, mythos, religion, and things like that, but you've revealed very little of the actual campaign world. Understanding that you plan to develop only what you plan to use and need for adventures, how much of the campaign world have you developed within and beyond Alandria? So that's a great question. And I don't mind answering that question to kind of show you, how I'm doing this, which is the whole point of these world building episodes, is to, show a DM coming up with their world and how this particular DM is doing it, so that you can hopefully learn something from that and maybe get some inspiration for building your own world. So, I don't have a lot of specifics like the stuff DM Nell's asking about. I do have some very rough sketches of maps I've made of, kind of where Alandria is in the world geographically, what's nearby. But to kind of give you an idea of what I have is kind of very similar to if you look to the map of the Eye of the World, or the map for the Ninth World of Numenera, where you just see kind of a snapshot of a small part of the world. That's kind of what I have for Primordia. I have Alandria. It's on a coast. It's geographically analogous to Seattle as far as where it's located. So it's on the west coast of a continent. It's like the North and South America continent. I'm envisioning this continent as extending quite a ways north to south, like a long ways, just like, you go all the way from the northernmost reaches of Canada all the way to Tierra del Fuego at the tip of South America. I mean, that's a long ways. And so I want that same kind of thing where you can travel a long ways north or south and encounter all kinds of different lands. So just like Seattle, Alondria is on that West Coast, kind of in the area where, it's starting to get a little cooler. You're not like in the Arctic yet. You're not even in the like Sword Coast North yet. You're not that far north yet, but you're getting there. So there's a long ways you can go to the south. There's quite a ways you can go to the north, but before too long, you're going to get into pretty cold areas. Again, similar to Seattle, there is a mountain range kind of analogous to the Cascade Mountains to the east. And there are, only a few passes through those mountains. And then to the west is the ocean. There are some islands to the west that are kind of the homelands of the Minotaur. And yeah, just some general ideas like that. As far as the area around Alondria, I did when I ran the previous adventures in Primordia, I came up with kind of an area map. So I know where the nearest human city is that they trade with. I know where the nearest elven city is. Right now, people in Alondria, I don't think maybe necessarily know what's going on with the elves there. I haven't decided yet because there are some elves in Alondria. And so I guess I know, but I'm not sharing it right now because there's some secrets there I don't want to reveal yet. So I have a general idea of the kind of the landscape around Alondria, kind of what are the closest settlements, what direction are they, what's the terrain like, that kind of stuff. But not much more detailed than that. As far as other continents in the world, there are other continents, but I haven't given much thought to them. I recently watched a TV show on Teotihuacan, which is a really cool place that I really enjoyed learning about in school. And, since I got my degree in anthropology, there's been quite a bit more discovered about Teotihuacan. We have a very different view of what those people were like now than we did when I was in school. So I'm thinking very seriously about basing culture on that. I might base a culture on the Aztecs. I think the Aztecs were super cool. The Mayans, and I may even put that stuff in kind of where South America would be in Primordia. So it'd be far south of Alondria, but you could walk there theoretically. I mean, it's land the whole way, just like you could walk from Seattle to Brazil or whatever if you wanted to. Well, you'd probably have to swim across a river at some point, but you know what I'm saying. I have ideas like that. There are definitely cultures that I would like to base cultures on, but I haven't really thought beyond that, because right now I'm focused on Alondria. That's where my first campaigns will take place, and probably won't worry too much about developing anything beyond that until I have player characters that are like, hey, we're going to go south and see what's to the south, or we're going to sail west and see what we find. Then at that point I would be like, oh crap, I better figure out what's west on the ocean from here, or what's south of the area around Alondria. So until that happens, I'm not too concerned about that. So right now I'm really focused on Alondria. I've started working on the harbor district because I don't think I need a whole city detailed to start running my first adventure. If I have the harbor district pretty well detailed and I start to PCs off there, and everything they kind of need is there. There's not like a huge reason for them to go elsewhere. And if they do, then I'll deal with that then. Again, I expand as needed. But as for right now, I've got Alondria. I'm drilling down into the harbor district of Alondria and starting to develop that. I have general ideas of what's around Alondria, what some of the closest settlements are to Alondria, some general ideas about who some of their trading partners are. I have some general ideas about the nearest elven city and what's going on over there. I have some general ideas about the nearest dwarven settlement and what's going on over there. Now I need to start thinking about the gnomes, since I'm thinking I might bring gnomes into it. I need to decide what's going on with the nearest gnome settlement. But again, I'm really focusing on what do I need for my player characters, right? So right now, all I need is Alondria and, a few days march from Alondria. That's all I really need. Now, if the player characters start heading south and they're really determined to go south, then I know I better come up with some stuff to the south because they're heading that way, and I need something. Or if they get really interested in the inner city of Elandria and they want to go there, then I'll start developing that. Or if they get really interested in traveling to the nearest elven city, Faelil, and exploring that, well, then I'll have to develop more of that. So, outside of Elandria and the surrounding region, I just have kind of general, kind of broad stroke ideas. And I haven't really gone much beyond that because I don't need to. And I really don't want to until I have to. Part of it is just time management and focusing on developing what I need for my game right now. But part of it's just leaving things open. If I don't need to know about the nearest dwarven city right now for anything relevant to what's happening in the campaign right now, if I don't need to know that, then why define it? Why pin it down before I need to? Because something could happen in the story with the players that maybe changes what I'm thinking. Like maybe right now I'm thinking the dwarven city is a certain way, but later I want to change my mind because of something that one of the player characters is really interested in. Like maybe one of the player characters really wants to play a dwarf and has really cool ideas about what that dwarf character's home city would be like. Well, if I haven't really developed the dwarven city much, I can use all those ideas and I don't have to throw out stuff I've already come up with or change things. I can just run with it. So that's kind of my philosophy is I try not to develop more than I need to so that it can be kind of gray mist. So when the time comes that we need to know about that area of the world, we can then decide what we need it to be. And the other thing is I really want to bring player creativity into this as much as possible. So for instance, kind of an example of this in my Storm King's Thunder campaign, we're doing this travel montage and Steve says, oh, I have this idea for this village that this group of halflings is building. So it's a new village. They're building it and it's called Foggy Bottom. One of the players came up with it. And as we just kind of on the fly were role-playing there, I declared as the dungeon master that at this point, the only building that they've completed is the inn/tavern. And, they've started building other buildings, but the inn is the only building that has a roof. It's the only building that's completed at this point. And that's really it. It's settled by the stout halflings. They built an inn. They're building other buildings. I'm thinking it's going to be a trading community and going to capitalize on people traveling the long road from place to place. But that's it. And I've told the players that that's pretty much all I have and that they're free to declare things about Foggy Bottom that they want. So, one of my players is moving right now and he's not going to be able to make the next session or two. So he's going to do, write some stories about his character and what's going on. And he is probably going to develop Foggy Bottom a little bit in the stories. And I've said, feel free to do what you want because I'm pretty open right now because I haven't come up with anything really for Foggy Bottom other than what I came up with on the fly during the session. And even that stuff I came up with on the fly during the session. So it's not like I'm married to any of those ideas if a player has a better idea. So I really like that. And I want to leave as much of that open as I can. So let's say I'm running a campaign in Primordia and the player characters, let's say there is not an elven portal to Faelil, the nearest elven city. I haven't decided yet if there is or not. I kind of waffle. Let's say there's not. And let's say the players decide, hey, we want to establish trade with Faelil so we can trade with the elves and blah, 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 blah. And we want to learn more about what's going on with the elves. We want to see the elven city. So we're going to travel there, right? It's like, okay, well, it's going to take, a week of game time to get to Faelil. And we're going to do a travel montage and we're going to have some encounters on the way. So maybe it'll be, a couple sessions before we get to Faelil. I would tell the player characters, well, this is what I'm thinking for Faelil so far. This is what I have so far. Feel free to help me fill in any of these blanks that you want. So player characters could say, oh, hey, Faelil has a church to this god and this is what it's like. Or, Fayleal produces this kind of export or whatever. Like anything that I haven't already defined is up for grabs if a player has an idea. And so, that's another reason I don't want to develop things that I don't need to, because I want to leave it open to player ideas. Because I think that a world where I have players helping me come up with stuff is going to be way cooler than something I do all by myself, which is, one of the reasons that I talk about it on the podcast, because I think a world where I get ideas from you is going to be way cooler than something I come up with completely by myself. And, those of you that have listened to a lot of these episodes have seen how the world has grown and evolved very much based on listener ideas and submissions, and how you've really had an impact on the trajectory and what this world is becoming by the ideas that you give me. And I think that's super cool. So I hope I answered your question, DM Nell. And G-Ferg, we've got some questions from G-Ferg. G-Ferg says, how do rangers and druids work in Primordia? I mean, considering they are out in the wild sorts, how does one become one? How do they survive? So that's a great question. And, the handful of protected human cities are, the only remaining known human settlements, but that is not to say that they're the only remaining human settlements. There may be isolated villages or towns here and there that somehow held on. And I think places like that would be a great origin for a druid or ranger character. I could easily see someone becoming a druid or a ranger in that kind of environment. But, someone who lives in Alandria could easily become a druid or ranger, because if you're going to be an adventurer, you're going to be leaving the city. And as soon as you step outside the walls of the city, you are in the wilds. It's not like Forgotten Realms where there's a village or a town every so many miles. It's wilderness and ruins outside of these handful of cities. So you're totally on your own. So I think that druids and rangers would be great characters to play in Primordia. They'd be very helpful characters to have if you're adventuring outside of the cities. And I think a lot of adventuring parties or teams in the guild would have either a druid or ranger or maybe a barbarian in their ranks, because you're going to need someone who's good at survival, and that'll be something interesting in Primordia. Is it might change the dynamic of the ideal party a little bit, because when we think of the basic four, we're thinking of a dungeon adventure where you want a cleric, you want a wizard, you want a rogue, you want a fighter kind of thing, right? From the OD&D days. Well, in Primordia, you probably want all those things, but you're probably also going to want someone who's really good at survival, which could be a druid, it could be a ranger, it could be a barbarian, it could be any character class with the right background, like I think the Outlander background gets survival. So that could be kind of a fifth required element that your party needs in Primordia. And everybody's going to kind of want to be stealthy in Primordia, I think. So, I think druids and rangers will be a very in-demand character class in the setting. I think they'll be a great choice for a player character, for a player to play. I think as soon as you leave the city, they're going to be very powerful characters to play. As far as how they work, I think it's kind of self-explanatory, really. You look at a druid or a ranger, and they're very well suited to survive in the wilds. So I think you could have druids and rangers who are out in the wilds living out there. You could have druids that are living solitary existences out in the wilds, and they're able to get by because of their abilities. They can survive when other people can't. Same thing with rangers. You could also have groups of rangers that are living together in the wild, or druids and rangers. So I think those would be interesting things to explore. And I think it's almost a given that if you did find some kind of village or settlement or camp of humans or some other race out in the wilds that isn't behind one of these mythals, that they probably would have at least one druid and or ranger among them. And that's part of the reason that they have been able to hold on when other people couldn't. So G-Ferg says, with the mythals in the cities, they keep out critters and such, but would that also keep out exotic mounts? And that's a really good question. And this is kind of another sort of revision I've made Originally I was thinking that these magical force fields would keep out things like fiends, celestials, dragons, undead, stuff like that. I'm still trying to figure that out. But as time goes on, I discard more and more of that because of exactly what G. Ferg is saying. It's like, well, if the mythal will keep out dragons, then there goes the chance of there being good dragons in the city or dragons that are allied with the guild being able to come into the city. If they keep out any kind of extraplanar creatures, well, now you can't have tieflings in the city and you can't have Aasimar in the city and so on and so on. So right now I'm more thinking that the mythals prevent rifts from opening within them. They prevent teleportation and planar travel across their boundaries, but they don't so much prevent specific kinds of creatures from crossing their boundaries. Those kinds of protections are more along the lines of the actual walls and the magical protections that are built into the walls of the city, as well as the various guardians that protect the city. So those kinds of things are going to be the things that are going to protect you from dragons and demons and stuff like that. The mythals more protect from rifts and portals and stuff opening within the city itself. So that's what I'm thinking right now. And that may be all that they do. I may go the line of mythals and Forgotten Realms and say that maybe, if you're attuned to this magical field, there are certain spell-like abilities you get or things like that. But I'm actually kind of leaning away from that, not only because if I say it limits certain creatures from entering, it could limit what player characters can do. So not only that, but also, I'm going to have the gifts of Primordia, these gifts of magic the player characters get. They're going to get things from the guild. They're going to get things from their stronghold and followers. So I don't think I need to give them mythal abilities on top of everything else. They could just get out of hand. So right now I'm kind of leaning towards just saying that all these mythals do is prevent teleportation and prevent rifts from opening and things like that. But we'll see. Jury's still out on that. So kind of the same topic, G. Ferg goes on to say, I figure some players may want to get a griffin or a hippogriff or a pegasus or something like that, some kind of exotic mount. But would the mythal keep them from being able to go in the city? So right now I'm thinking no. If the player characters make friends with a copper dragon, the copper dragon can come into the city. The thing that would prevent that dragon from coming into the city isn't the mythal or the magical force field. It would be the beings, the guardians that protect the city, which are going to be the guards, and also things like constructs or things like magical ballistas and catapults and stuff like that, siege weapons, summoned guardians, things like that. So those kinds of things are controlled by people. So if we know, this particular dragon's okay, then, we won't try to kill it, kind of thing. And then finally, G. Ferg says, do the other races also utilize mythals or the old magic to keep their holds and cities safe, like the dwarves, elves, and such? And simply put, yes, at least some of them do. So, keep in mind that these magical force fields are actually elven. They were created by elves, these ancient human cities that have these force fields that humanity has retreated to were all originally built by elves and then were later settled by humans and expanded by humans. So the what we're calling mythals were created using elven magic by elves. So it's not a huge leap to assume that any elven cities that exist out there will have similar magics protecting them. As far as the dwarves, I haven't decided. Part of this will depend on what I decide regarding the Underdark, and we discussed this in the last world building episode when I was answering questions. Someone was asking what would protect Underdark cities from the rifts, and I was thinking either they have mythals to protect them, like the surface cities, or perhaps the magical radiation is stronger in the Underdark and is so strong that the rifts can't open there. So, if I go that direction and say that the radiation is stronger in the Underdark and rifts can't open there, then the dwarves wouldn't really need mythal technology. They would just build their cities deep enough that the radiation protects them. But if I don't go that route, then, I would probably have the dwarves have something similar to protect their cities. Halflings, I don't really see halflings having cities. I believe even in the player's handbook, it says like the Lightfoot halflings don't so much build settlements. It's really the Souths that do. And even them, I see them building more towns and villages. I don't see them building cities. They more inhabit cities built by the other races. Gnomes, I don't know. They would, if they have cities, they would probably have some kind of magic to protect them. I'm not sure. You know, one thing I've been thinking about doing with the gnomes, is to take a page from Pathfinder's playbook and having them closely tied to the Feywild, and maybe even saying that the gnomes kind of maybe live in the Feywild, and maybe the gnomes have cities, but their cities are in the Feywild. They're not in Primordia. So I could do something like that. I'm not sure. So I guess to answer your question, G-Ferg, well, first of all, the mythals were created by elves, not humans, using the old magic. And second of all, the elves weren't necessarily the only races throughout the history of Primordia that had some way of protecting from the rifts. But again, you know, and this is kind of a new mystery that I've introduced now. If I go with the revision that the rifts just started happening during the retreat, they didn't happen before, that creates a new mystery, which I like, which is, well, why is it if the rifts didn't exist thousands of years ago, why is it that the mythals protect from them? These mythals were built or created thousands of years ago before the rifts existed, and they conveniently protect from the rifts. How is that? Is it maybe the rifts did exist in the past and we just don't remember, or that knowledge has been lost? Did the elves way back then somehow know the future and know that rifts would be a problem in the future? And, you know, being elves, even though it was thousands of years, they thought this was something we should prepare for? Or is there an even stranger explanation? So that'll be a fun mystery to explore as well. All right. Well, I think it's about time to wrap up episode 130. This is going to be a doozy, guys. The world building episodes tend to be longer, but we had a lot to get through today. And I just have so much coming on the show. I hate to do an episode this long, but I wanted to get through this stuff because I was afraid if I didn't do it now, I never would, because there's just so much planned already for future episodes. And, you know, there's only so much time to make episodes. So it's kind of like do it now or I may never do it. So I apologize that this was a long episode. Hopefully it was time well spent. I had fun. I hope you had fun. So I've covered all of the listener questions about Primordia that I've gotten up to this point, but I'm always willing to do more Primordia kind of focused episodes, more world building focused episodes. So if you still have questions or things you want me to discuss related to Primordia or world building in general, feel free to let me know. There are lots of ways you can get a hold of me. Probably the easiest, best ways are to either email me at gamemastersjourney@gmail.com or leave a comment on our community over on Google+. And you can find a link to that in the show notes at starwalkerstudios.com. So I hope that you have a chance to play your favorite RPG this week. I'll be back soon with another episode of Game Master's Journey. Until then, game on.
This has been a Starwalker Studios production, your source for quality gaming and hobby podcasts.
This episode's music courtesy of Cloudwalker, Transboy, Renfield, Stanko, and Ish. See the show notes for more details at starwalkerstudios.com/Game Master's Journey.